Seeing a lot of familiar faces, it's really nice to see all of you here. A lot of good memories, so can I just give a big hand to everyone who's here? Yes! And the other person I would like to thank is Neyran Turan. Thank you so much. We've had these conversations. My interest in you was, we talked about it earlier, was the exhibition that you had on ADUs. And knowing that the work that you've done previously, how did those two things even collide or work together was, for me, very intriguing. And so, again, thank you for coming down to hear you talk. 2 reminders, we have 2 lectures coming up. One is Hendrik Cam, Friday, April 7th at 2 p.m. Come early, it'll be a blast. And then something that we've been trying to do, and I probably talked to some of you a little bit ago about it, is that we really want to start bringing alumni who have their own practices, who have worked at particular firms to come back and kind of give a talk in terms of what they've been doing since they've graduated here at the Woodbury San Diego campus. So look for that one of your former instructors will be bugging you to come give a talk. Also, I see a lot of people who've taught here before as well, and we would like to do the same, so we would like to invite you to come give a talk and see what you guys have been up to, especially as we're coming into this eclipse of the last year of our campus. So to kind of start that off, we're going to start that off Friday, April 21st with Prismatica. They're just down the street. They've been doing some projects here, so it's going to be exciting to see what they've been up to as well. Anyways, with Neyran. So Neyran Turan is an architect and founding partner of NEMESTUDIO. She is currently Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. Her work focuses on alternative forms of environmental imagination within architecture and their capacity for new aesthetic and political trajectories within architecture and urbanism. She holds a doctorate degree of design at Harvard, a master's of environmental design at Yale, and a bachelor of architecture from Istanbul Technical University. Neyran is the founding chief editor of New Geographies journal, which was the editor-in-chief of its first 2 volumes, New Geographies Zero and New Geographies After Zero, which, by the way, I have New Geography Zero when it came out, so lovely book. I really appreciate it. And her recently published book, Architecture as Measure, from Aktar Publishers, has been awarded the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. Turan has been the curator for the Pavilion of Turkey in the 2021 Venice Biennale. So this was just a couple of years ago, I guess during the pandemic when it happened last year. So that's been a challenge. Yeah. So anyways, enough of me, but please welcome Neyran Turan.
Thank you so much, Jose, and everyone for being here. There's so much energy here, so that's really great. And I will talk about basically my work and recent work, which aims to prompt, as Jose said, some unfamiliar couplings between architecture and planetary imagination. I will present some recent projects, including my latest book, Architecture as Measure. So this is a snapshot, just to give you a visual, maybe, introduction about myself and my work at NEMESTUDIO for the last couple of maybe 5 or 6 years. And the work is usually ranging from commissioned exhibition projects, buildings, publications, speculative projects, and generally our work reimagines the idea of the architecture practice and reflects on the ways in which architecture knowledge is produced, paying close attention to its specific placement in the world. Before talking about the work itself, I promise I'm not going to show you pictures like this throughout the day, but I want to start with 2 images, just as a provocation. First is a photograph This is a photograph from the remote Henderson Island, which lies in the Pacific Ocean, halfway between New Zealand and Chile. Henderson Island was named the UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988 for its, quote, rare ecology that is practically untouched by human presence, unquote. And now you see what is it now. So, however, the island was again a focus of attention in 2015, and now this is a photograph from actually 2015. It was very touched, as you see, as part of a research looking into South Pacific Gyre, which is just really trash collecting in the Pacific Ocean. And the researchers found more than 55 pieces of human-made trash, mainly plastic deposited by the ocean. So there's no one living here, but the trash that we produce, basically, globally, is actually collecting here. And it's the peak density of plastic debris collected anywhere in the world. So this immense collection of a wide array of plastic objects depicting on a supposedly pristine remote island not only stages confrontations of our material politics of consumption and accumulation, but also points to a puzzling fact. It depicts a climate in crisis in which no place on Earth is untouched by its effects. Instead of pristine conceptions of nature, it makes us aware of the complicated and messy relationships between heritage and climate change. The second image I want to start with is an image of a color. A tone of orange, which is defined as the CMYK color model as 0% cyan, 50% magenta, and 100% yellow. A little more than 2 years ago, on September 9, 2020, San Drancisco Bay Area woke up to this orange sky. Seeming like scenes from a kind of science fiction movie, similar color shifts caused by the smoke from the recent wildfires worldwide give hints to a changing and damaged planet, where extreme weather events are becoming a norm. This new Earth of climate emergency is called as Earth with extra A in the middle, in the recent writings of environmentalist Bill McKibben. So these two images are actually the conceptual backgrounds of my book, Architecture as Measure. The book positions climate change as a cultural and political idea that requires a different kind of planetary imagination. When I say planetary, I mean the vast geotemporal scales through which climate emergency accelerates. The book starts with the provocation that we should stop talking about planetary imagination in architecture through specific frameworks that we're actually used to conceptualizing for the last 2 decades or so. These comfortable frameworks see planetary imagination either as isolated idea of preserving nature, that's something we know, as a technological fix, oh, with the right technology we can fix this, or as the visualization of large-scale phenomena, or even maybe sustainability. So we cannot think of the planetary only through the lens of preserving nature. We can think of the Henderson Island example that I showed you, that it's not pristine anymore. How can you talk about preservation of nature when nature has actually changed? And we cannot return to a more innocent state of nature because it doesn't exist. Because doing so would lack an understanding of the political landscape of our current moment. As shown in that island, Henderson Island example, from the upper atmosphere to the deep seas, nature as we know it is something else altogether with human intervention all over it. So it is difficult to argue for the preservation of an idea of nature that is defined by purity and redemption. We cannot think of the planetary also through the managerial tendencies of technofix and problem solving either. This tendency rests on an anthropocentric superiority complex, like the heroic Earth mastering of geoengineering and terraforming projects, for instance. And finally, we cannot simply understand planetary imagination in architecture as a project of just large-scale mapping and visualization, because limiting the scope of the planetary with just a scalar bias of the large would bypass systemic intricacies between the large and the small. Yes, architects can be great and helpful very much to make visible the large-scale invisibilities of climate change. However, for architecture, planetary imagination also should be more than just how to best visualize the planet. So instead of conceptualizing the environment as in need of protection, management, or visualization, the book argues that instead of perpetuating these frameworks, it's important at this moment for architecture to consider its planetary imagination through a different kind of inner focus and broader engagement, an imagination that takes into account architecture's disciplinary inner workings, techniques, and histories. In that sense, the primary motivation behind the book is to provoke unconventional collisions between larger planetary questions and the quotidian aspects of architecture's inner workings. I argue in the book that it's important to appreciate the power of these inner workings because it's important to reveal, unhinge, and more importantly, to remake the world we design, the institutions we build, and the systems of knowledge and value through which we imagine architecture and the world. So in addition to the introductory essay, the book consists of 9 chapters. Each chapter contains an essay by myself and is coupled with a project by NEMESTUDIO. So in a way, I'm gonna slowly smooth into some projects, but you will realize that I'm actually talking about a project. So this Earth, or Earth, I have to say, within 2A, is this new Earth of climate crisis. One could say that it's not that it needs a kind of another discussion, radical imagination, but also I think it needs for us to imagine what it means to practice architecture today. So given our current environmental, political, and economic instabilities, an interest to reimagine architecture practice should not be creating just new words for the old way of doing things, and should go beyond exhausted and well-known undertakings in our field. For instance, a quest regarding practice, a kind of new idea of practice, cannot be just about overindulgent exercises that see architecture as small, concerned with these more critical problems, and attempt to constantly go beyond architecture by avoiding it altogether. It also cannot be about myopic exercises of navel-gazing with architecture conventions that actually bypass the world itself. And finally, we cannot just think about practice just as problem solving, because instead of accepting the issues as they are, there needs to be a level of questioning those issues in terms of architecture in the world. So the provocation of thinking about planetary imagination and architecture practice differently is about looking for the answer somewhere else, which is at the clash of the planetary and the quotidian I just talked about. It's about rethinking practice from within by politically confronting the nuances of its inner workings. This very recent project, Earthly with a 2A, Ever After, focuses on these questions by imagining a future architecture practice in which new ways of living, building, and unbuilding are taking place. We see a room which depicts the corner of an architectural studio. An architecture model of collective living is sitting on a table. The sky is orange outside from wildfires. Air filters are very thick in this room. The garment on the hanger has gloves and a mask attached to its body. Some architecture paperwork is on the table, giving hints about the new norms of architecture practice. In Earth, the Earth 2A, or in this new world, unique sensibilities are emerging and new stories are being told. So the idea, I'm going to just pause a second to talk about the idea of drawing in our practice, which you're going to kind of see recurring as I talk through. So the idea that draws representation sensibilities of the project and some other projects at our office is the idea of implosion on the surface of the drawing. So instead of understanding architectural representation as a medium that conveys its message from one point of view, implosion is about multiple perspectives coexisting together on the image. So let's pay attention to this to understand what I mean. So this idea actually, the idea of implosion, relates very much to the representational techniques of split painting. And here you're seeing an example of that from 16th and 17th centuries, or sometimes they were called paintings within a painting, which split the picture plane into 2 scenes and juxtaposes 2 very contrasting representation techniques on the same picture plane. For instance, here on the screen, we see a still life of everyday objects in the foreground of the painting, which uses descriptive and realistic techniques. And in contrast, if you look at the back of the room, we just see a different kind of scene. Actually, this is the sacred scene of Christ, Mary and Martha, with an offering of spiritual food. So that's more of a narrative underpinning. So they're not only telling two different stories about food, but also the representational techniques are really different. So in this painting and many of our drawings, two vantage points of the same reality coexist in the same space of representation like this. And those, like two realities, are usually, in our case, we're not looking at food and the religious or the everyday of the food, but mostly planetary dimension of the same, a kind of familiar thing, and then architectural familiar topic and the planetary dimension of that. I have written about this condition before, and in the architecture measure book, in the last chapter, I talk about implosion in relation to drawings. So if you come back to this image, drawing that I showed you before, you can understand an image in the same way. Architectural model on the foreground, a burning planet in the background. In another setting of the same project, we see the same architectural model being exhibited in other museums. In this case, you see the same building now in an exhibition. And two exhibitions are happening on the top and below floors of the museum. And the image that we're looking at just basically presents that as a coexistent reality. The upper room in the museum exhibits what we named as the Orange Sky Celestial Map, a fictional chart, sky chart, populated with endangered and steward species around the wildfire areas of Australia, Amazonia, California, and many others. So according to this time, in this drawing, this is a time when construction is different and it's regenerative. Materials are not only to reused, reassembled, and repurposed. For the depicted building, straw, sawdust, and other agricultural products, byproducts are wrapped in waterproof biotextiles to create insulation and roofing. Construction waste is mixed with biobinders to develop building blocks to carry the four roofs. Scripted architecture paperwork protocols evidence new practice norms, and while accounting for care and stewardship. And in the final drawing of the project, we see a glimpse of the larger systems that are making this new practice possible. Small controlled burnings can be seen over existing forests. These intentional burnings gives us clues about indigenous wisdom and care for the land and its life. Both the landscape and the architecture practice itself are regenerative at this time frame. So through the restaging of the architectural model in various settings in this project, we not only become aware of new ways of living and imagining the earth, but we are also reminded of the impossible separation between architecture's own making, the planetary imagination that is part of, and the more extensive systemic changes that enable its presence. So in parallel to using familiar interdisciplinary workings of architectural representation to talk about seemingly unfamiliar things like planetary scale, alternative futures, we very much value the exact opposite in our work. This marks an interest, a kind of right now a little bit maybe growing interest in interpretations of familiar and ordinary architectural questions and their capacity for nuanced engagements with reality. Here is current work in progress for a house in Denver that's going to be construction pretty soon, a project that investigates parts of a house, its domesticity, construction. Projects like this allow us not only, let's say, allow some kind of uncomfortable, we were talking about that earlier, uncomfortable confrontations with architecture's making, but also enable other kinds of imaginations to unfold and maybe evolve back in our work. And this is the project that Jose mentioned. Another example of that sensibility would be a recent project that we did last year for an ADU project in San Leandro, California, which was for an exhibition at Worcester Hall, which takes on questions of alternative land ownership models concerning community land trusts, the carbon footprint of construction, and the actual labor of construction and maintenance through revisiting the architectural specification itself. So commissioned by an exhibition, the provocation of the project is that I don't think you can read anything well or hard, so small, right? Commissioned by an exhibition, the provocation of the project is that construction sensibilities are hidden in specifications. Instead of merely listing the tasks related to material assemblies at the initial construction, This new specification here, you actually see all these kinds of tasks that are related to constructing this. Instead of just listing material assemblies after construction, which is usually how we understand specification, this new specification accounts for various tasks and instructions relating to land ownership, maintenance, continuous stewardship, disassembly, and paperwork. So the idea of, let's say, maybe labor that is involved in maybe even making things possible and bringing that kind of wider sensibility into this very mundane thing of the spec was the driver of the project, among others. So now you might think, so this was the conversation we're having. Like somehow, from the small to the big, there's always that, I think, move back and forth in our work. Now we're going to zoom out. I will continue with a set of projects, actually, that were completed in the past 5 years and that are included in the architecture measure book, which these projects use familiar architectural strategies on what is considered to be unfamiliar within a disciplinary setting and brings them into the space of the architectural imagination through architectural drawings. So I'm showing a drawing from Museum of Lost Volumes from 2015. I don't know if I can say an old project, but it feels new, but I think it's been many years now that we can say it's actually the oldest project in the book, an earlier one. So the project imagines a museum of ancient resource extraction ruins for a time when mining is actually ancient practice. Its ruins are treated like ancient monuments or extinct species to be housed in a natural history museum. So this is a new natural history museum in the future. It is a museum that preserves geologic ruins that once belonged to the resource extraction of rare earth minerals mining. The project misuses familiar techniques and forms from architecture history by dismantling their original myths to tell perhaps a more difficult story. For instance, here we see a geological section that takes the monumental and sublime qualities of 18th century architect Blaise Cenotaph. You might just maybe seen his drawings in architecture history classes, which in this case becomes a place to commemorate mineral extraction instead of Enlightenment ideals. It imagines a collision between a disciplinary future and a disciplinary past to reflect on our current moment. Here it might be helpful, actually, to talk about why the emphasis on imagination when talking about the environment, especially when urgent action on many fronts is already overdue. It is precisely because of the urgency of our current moment that I'm driven by the significance of imagination. Imagination matters because, as law professor Genevieve Purdy, who writes about Anthropocene, in his writings on the Anthropocene, on climate crisis, that he says imagination is about how we see and how we learn to see the world. It is about picturing it, assessing what matters, and how we have a stake in it. As evidenced by the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Black Lives Matter protests worldwide, the intricacies of systemic injustice and climate emergency call for unconventional approaches that can actually help us to see and learn to see differently and make sense of the collision between the quotidian and the planetary. Second, imagination matters because, as many geographers point out, climate change is not about a self-righteous battle between nature and humans, but the consequence of centuries of extractivism, colonialism, and racism. Simply put, the humans who are the most responsible for climate change, who cause the most problems, are most insulated from its effects, whereas those who are the least accountable feel its greatest impact. Another image from the Museum of Lost Volume project shows the museum's grand tour, an excursion to one-to-one scale rare earth replicas. While all the replicas are inverted upside down, reminding us of the ziggurats from ancient civilizations, visitors take the grand tour to these geographic ruins to be terrified by their artificial magnificence. The customary grand tour of archaeological sites taken by the architectural nobles of the 17th and 18th centuries to mostly Italy is now replaced with another kind of tour, perhaps, in this project, this time with the ruins and monuments of anthropogenic climate change. So the famous 1981 photograph of architecture historian Rainer Banham, So this is California, you might know that, so he's here. This is a very famous scene where he actually rides a bike throughout the American desert. Or Robert Venturi. You know, you might remember his famous pose looking at Las Vegas in 1968 and kind of, you know, writing his theory about urbanism after that. But in this image, these two men are puzzled, and their relevance is very different. Benham is biking near this giant replica of a rare earth mine at the outdoor desert wasteland outside the museum. Inside, instead of the empty American desert, for which he would always say, we are, quote, culturally naked and ill-prepared, unquote, to comprehend. So in this case, he's trying to comprehend this landscape. Both men, Benham and Venturi, are probably puzzled and clueless in the scene with a shared question. What happens when the new Rome of architecture is not Los Angeles, like it was for Benham, or Las Vegas, like it was for Venturi? In other words, what if the new Rome is the planetary wasteland itself? Millions of visitors would visit the museum annually and take the grand tour of these inverted monuments. When they returned home after visiting this museum, they would perhaps be filled with admiration, anxiety, and thankfulness for the resources of this rare thing called the earth. And finally, imagination matters because it is the ultimate and most necessary ingredient for meaningful structural change in architecture and related design disciplines. Instead of, on the one hand, pretending that inequalities of labor, colonialism, or resource extraction are external to the work that we do as architects, and on the other hand, dismissing questions of aesthetics, appearance, and technique as just trivial matters. What kind of worlds are possible if we're truly willing to understand the embeddedness, the collision, and the specificities of these aspects within our practices and disciplinary imaginations? These questions are important not only for dismantling archaic assumptions and abolishing entrenched power structures in our discipline, but also for rebuilding future foundations for alternative worlds that are yet to be envisioned. Another project from the book, titled The Middle Earth, Dioramas for the Planet, that you see here, has similar kind of ambitions. The project repurposes the staging of the diorama in a natural history museum as a way to speculate on climate change. While working on this project, we became obsessed, and I have to say really more than, is there a word more than obsessed, with dioramas. And natural history dioramas are interesting because they are constructs of fake natures. Think about your experience to a natural history museum, for instance, and then looking at a diorama. And they are kind of microcosmic theater stages. I say fake natures because they depict an idealized nature, not the Henderson Island trash, in which environmental controversies are hidden and replaced by magic and wonder. So this museum is situated, imagines itself, situated in the kind of, in a coordinates of 0 longitude and 0 latitude. That's the middle of the Earth. The exact location on Earth where the equator crosses the prime meridian near Gulf of Guinea, Africa. Each diorama in the museum depicts a specific problem brought by climate change, especially taking place at the middle of the Earth, meaning around the equator, the Earth's 0-degree latitude, the melting of icebergs, deforestation in Brazil and Indonesia, plastic waste in the Pacific Ocean, mining in Singapore, and the e-waste dump sites in Ghana. So the entrance hall of the museum has a giant relief map model which shows the exact location of the museum on the Earth. And the project has these kinds of dioramas, where dioramas which demystify kind of the idea or idealism of nature and restages these myths to talk about more difficult things like climate change itself. So you can imagine it as maybe 200 years from now, or maybe even less, there's a natural history museum, and our kids, future generations are really looking back to what we did with climate change through these dioramas. Here we see a room in the museum called Plastic Pacific Hall. The room contains a large diorama that portrays the plastic trash collected in the Pacific Ocean. Or dioramas like this that depict an assembly of sand depicting sand mining in Singapore. Or another room called the Triptych of Air Conditioning, a diorama that depicts extravagant use of air conditioning around the world, 0-degree latitude. Each frame shows the use of air conditioning concerning the daily activities of ancient humans, which is us. So in the project, we were inspired by artist Richard Barnes' diorama work, which debunks diorama's magic and wonder. And he takes photographs like this, which he basically photographs dioramas that are in construction, maintenance, or repair. He goes into natural history museums when these maintenance basically activities are happening instead of in their ideal state. So in these photographs, we see maintenance workers inside dioramas, either fixing things. I don't know if that guy's sleeping or fixing something. Or vacuuming artificial snow while facing the buffalo taxidermy. That's my favorite. So the dioramas are not in their ideal state at all, and instead in construction, revealing their metal studs, plywood frames, plastic wraps around taxidermies, and blue tapes. So here we see a large room containing dioramas that depict the deforestation process in Brazil and Indonesia around the 0-degree latitude. Each diorama depicts the act of clearance and renewal of forests for non-forest use. And as you see in the front, these dioramas are also in this act of they're not in their ideal state. So in addition to stating real issues of climate change, the dioramas in the museum are also, as I said, are in a state of construction or maintenance. So there are two things at interplay that in projects that are similar to this in our work. On the one hand, by restaging familiar models and replicas such as diorama, the theater set, and the messy stories and controversies of resource extraction, waste, and environmental injustice in the Anthropocene, the notion of nature as an ideal and universal model is gone. On the other hand, a slowed down attention to construction and assembly is proposed by revealing the mundane details of these models making and unmaking. So I want to use this photo. Maybe you're thinking, she's fond of all these messy photos, like I started with the Anderson Island. Do you have a fetish for this? So the revealing of constructiveness is a theme that is taken in our work, actually. And I want to use this image to talk about that. So this is the work, this is actually a very famous work by Jeff Wall from 1978. He's a photographer, he's an artist. The work is called The Destroyed Room, which depicts a ravaged room. In the photo, we see a worn-out mattress surrounded by wreckage of scattered clothes, accessories, and smashed furniture. They're all shown in the damaged interior walls of the room. And when we first look at it, we might think it might look like as if there was some act of violence in here. Yet, after close inspection, when we kind of really look at the image a little bit carefully, it becomes evident that the room is nothing more than artificial staging of reality, a diligent setup meant to give the impression that it has been passionately destroyed. For instance, if this mysteriously undamaged porcelain statue of a dancer standing on a cabinet reveals this artificiality. If this room was an act of violence, that porcelain would not be just standing like that. With that and other details, like bare walls seen in the back of the room, the door, we actually understand that the room is a set, a restaged event, or a model built in studio. So although the room looks very plausible, by revealing the constructiveness of the scene, Jeff Wall wants us to think about the limits of realism. A core question, if you think about photography, it's a really core question for photography to depict real scenes. So he's questioning that notion of photography. So this notion of revealing constructiveness is very interesting to us when considering architecture's inner workings. I'm interested in this relation, first and foremost, in terms of thinking about architecture's politics of appearance. How do we choose to show the things we make? The kinds of things that are embedded within this production, like even model making. Like in these images, it might mean a kind of a mundane act of how to stage our architecture models becomes something we think about. Constructiveness is also interesting in terms of how we choose to relate to the kinds of things that surround the making of architecture. That is, the planetary dimensions or all the context around it. You can also think of it as a search for an alternative idea of specificity and engagement through attention, subtlety, and detail. So architecture potentials of such confrontations between assembly and disassembly, between foreground and background, have driven most of our projects at NEMESTUDIO for the last couple of years. And it created different kinds of projects, For instance, this one from 2018, our Junk Bay Ruin, really kind of talks about the constructed images themselves. Here we see a drawing on the left, which presents the drawing as an assembled physical model. And on the right, it shows the drawing itself as a disassembled model, emphasizing the image's three-dimensionality, materiality, and constructiveness. Another example of this would be another project we did actually last fall, which is titled When Naked Kings All Gone. It was an exhibition on models, architecture models, and we did this 5x5 diorama that presents an imaginary scene-like model-like manner. So the scene is presented in a model-like manner. The phrase naked king comes from the infamous Emperor's New Clothes tale. In the project, the term refers to the power structure of our current time who enjoy the worldly pleasures of industrial capitalism while willfully ignoring the alarming future of climate emergency. We know that we have so many naked kings. While displaying something between a large architectural drawing and a model, the diorama assembles a seemingly impossible optimistic future as a tableau vivant, as if it already happened. So this was commissioned by the Model Behavior exhibition in Cooper Union last fall, and the large diorama stands on these stub legs. The front, this is a scene from the street out of Cooper Union. It's an imaginary scene taking place sometime after the risks of climate change emergency are gone. Maybe also the naked kings are gone, hopefully. And this is the scene that is actually close up. Instead of mythical creatures such as unicorns, here we see a carousel here with cattle mounted on posts, and because maybe they're not used anymore for meat. Forests are recovering from clearing and deforestation due to previous intensive livestock, mega farming, and other industrial production. And here you see how it's made. The image has a three-dimensionality. And the back of the diorama facing the exhibition interior showcases a different scene in another time, perhaps closer to our current moment. In this time frame, the physical model pieces included in the frontal part of the diorama that we just saw are now decomposed as props in a digital drawing. The sky is orange from the old Common fires, the wildfires. The diorama pieces are in a model photo shoot, and naked kings, unfortunately, are still with us, and the new future has not yet happened. So this sensibility also sometimes takes us to extremely different kind of projects. This is a very unique one. It was a virtual gathering space commissioned by the Architecture League of New York. And their goals are a ball party in 2021 as a virtual gathering space. It was conceptualized the virtual event because there was COVID restrictions. Usually these parties are just held in physical spaces. And the party took place on a new virtual platform where users could meet online and have a synchronic spatial experience. So it's like Zoom, but you can actually mingle with people, and when you come close, so they hear you. If you move around, apart, they don't, as if you're in a real party. So this is just showing a kind of, the project just doesn't, I'm not going to go into it, I'm just showing those different aspects of our work. But basically what happened, so what happens to the project is that the project uses perspective illusions to reflect on inflation. I'll adjust it for my computer. Thank you. So the project uses perspective illusions to reflect on the conflation of public and domestic spaces. So you on a room, you just feel like you're in a domestic space in your bedroom, and then suddenly you're in a party. So that's really what the experience was in this party, because everybody was joining from their bedrooms, and then you're just like drinking wine, but trying to intermingle and socialize. So in other projects like this one, a conversation between representation and construction is achieved by looking at the quotidian and seemingly banal aspects of architecture through a planetary framework. So Neyran's project, this is the one you're seeing a picture of, was originally prepared for the third Istanbul Design Biennial titled Are We Human in 2016, and it was created by Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley. The project looks at the temporal and spatial long span of architectural materiality. A long span that helps us to understand buildings as piles of which will circulate and construct before, while, and after the building is built, and participate within a complicated array of logistics, supply chains, from quarries to processing facilities, to construction assemblies and landfills. So beyond the performance metrics of professional building rating systems, this lead time between extraction and waste, and this is the word actually, lead time, in the supply chain literature, they actually call it the lead time, is mostly invisible in the architectural imagination. Just to give it a scale, each year, approximately 3 billion tons of raw materials are used in the manufacturing of building products and components worldwide. And it is estimated that over 10,000 different materials are used in the construction and use of buildings, many of which use non-renewable mineral resources that are depleted. So in addition to the movement of construction materials, there is the mostly overlooked labor dimension. Think about the number of people involved in helping to extract, assemble, repair, and demolish these materials within buildings. So Neyran's project engages with this long span of architectural materiality from a geographic perspective. It consists of an archipelago of 9 islands, presented through 5-feet models on pedestals, each complemented by one drawing. So one material is presented with one drawing and one model. Each island represents a particular lavish or widely used building material, such as leather, marble, wood, glass, styrofoam, etc. So the upper part of each model consists of a monument, an archetypical building mass that is finished with a specific material. And in opposition to the upper part, the lower part of each model consists of a rock, a formless landmass from which the raw matter is extracted. Here you see the project assembled as an installation. The stark contrast between the finished surfaces of the archetypical forms at the top and the formlessness of the naked source origins below aims to call attention to the line, that kind of space in between that we never talk about. So a similar double register is used in the drawings of the project. Consists of 2 parts, like the models. Each drawing depicts 2 different snapshots from the long span of one of those 9 materials. While the upper part of each drawing actually positions one material through a particular architectural lens. The lower part depicts a daily scene from the wider lifespan of the same material. On the left, for instance, you see industrial processing of aluminum in a hinterland, juxtaposed with aluminum wall details on the top. So the top is something we're more usually familiar with. On the right, we see a maintenance of a travertine curtain wall, juxtaposed with the shipping of travertine at the container port. On the left, management of waste mound in the Pacific Ocean, styrofoam with architectural details on the top. And on the right, copper piping of interiors or roofing at the construction site, etc. So the upper part of each drawing depicts architectural spaces or specifications as still lifes with traces of humans, but without actual humans. We don't see the humans, we just see their traces. In contrast to that, the lower part of each drawing showcases overpopulated human activity and presence at the site for extraction, transportation of waste. So in this way, the title of this exhibition was Are We Human? So what we did is we put humans more in the drawings in places that we don't usually associate with humans. Like we don't think about humans, meaning the kind of, walking around the extraction site. So we put, exaggerated their amount in those drawings. So that was actually our response to Are We Human? So here we see the kind of mining landscape of marble. The project calls for an architectural imagination that juxtaposes the planetary imaginary of these landscapes with the extremely quotidian aspects in relation to material practice of architecture. And these are really big drawings that were in the exhibition, so it's a little bit harder this way to see what those people are doing, but in each case, there's a certain narrative in the way that they're engaging with this. So I have 2 more, I hope that I'm on time. So before showing one last project, I'm just gonna talk about this one, which is a little different. It's a project on materiality, but in this case, a very different focus, which is between digital representation and construction. So this project consists of actually 4 buildings whose forms are created via a sampling process of digital ready-made objects. As an almost surrealist exquisite corpse, Each building investigates questions of assembly, ruination, and waste in the digital space. So the project speculates on architecture's materiality contrasts to the previous one from a completely different perspective in the context of digital accumulation. I'm sure that the students are very familiar with 3D warehouse, the places where there are so many kind of digital found objects, like a lot of models, objects, building elements, primitive forms, and it's a family of objects that's just, the listing is odd. I mean, there's so many different kinds of things. But when they are compiled together, if I were to map those objects, a kind of accumulation of digital objects, they are deprived of any material scale. Like when you find a model, for instance, sometimes it has a scale, sometimes the scale is wrong. But they're just almost like, digital, in a way, kind of accumulation of things. So in the project, each assembly is initially a scaleless compositional archetype, as seen on the top left, in which there's no scale in that top left drawing, in which various minuscule and oversized objects are flattened in scale, creating slightly unfamiliar compositional arrangements. For instance, you see a track unit, stairs, forms, they just compile and create a kind of building together. So this is really, in this case, an assembly that stages and exploits the potential of a particular composition. It's really thinking about initially digital composition, like form making. And then on the right, it turns the same kind of assembly to actually a building digitally, like by giving it scale, giving it kind of certain specs or kind of aperture and door and things that actually make it look more like a building and materiality. And eventually, the building is destabilized by time and the materiality of its mass. In that sense, in the project, materiality both defines and undermines the architecture of these archetypical compositions. So by depicting the formation of an architecture project from the accumulation of digital debris from the 3D warehouse to the material debris of waste, the project builds alternative linkages between architecture, digital media, and materiality, and opens up a range of aesthetic and political concerns for architecture and public imagination. So in the drawings of this project, it is also, they allude to these aspects by presenting, if you pay attention to the drawing, it almost like presents the drawing like a physical model that is being photographed. So if you pay attention to the entourage, the kind of things around the front of the object, they give scale to this. So you understand the scale, basically, of this building, right? With these kind of trucks or other things. But then, all of a sudden, this thing pops out, this water bottle. And the role of that, those entourage in the background, is to give its scale to the model itself. Then you realize, oh, okay, this is actually a model that's a little bit this size, or what is the scale of that model? So, as digital objects gain physical characteristics in this way, either through materiality or the staging of the model, the making of digital images becomes part of architecture's also materiality. So these are different kind of examples of how, here in this case, like drainage pipe, a grader, and different kinds of things, and all of a sudden become a kind of building, or and then it gets demolished. And of course, the materiality or the rubbish embedded within digital also needs to be considered, especially when you look at artists. They're really good at understanding these potentials of residues of digital processes. Consider there's an artist in the name of Clement Bolla, and in his Surface Proxy series, he really looks at the kind of translations between, from digital to material, between copy and the original. And they all lose their meaning because of the glitches that kind of happen between these layers of translation. And this is the last kind of example of that series of the kind of, there's a metronome here, and then suddenly it turns to the door, and there are all these kinds of translations that happen. So I'm gonna end with, I have one more last project, and then this is a video that kind of tells the story. I'm not gonna show the whole thing. Depending on your reactions, I might just change or kind of linger with it. I kind of use that technique a lot. That's the beauty of presenting physically. Because when you do a Zoom presentation, because you don't know the audience from their eyes, like they're bored, they're excited, they really want this to end, or they really, so you just kind of adapt to that. But basically what this does is, this is just showing, this was a separate, there was an exhibition in LA, and then we did the this video as part of that. But this is really kind of a little bit humorously talking about or kind of rehashing the processes that I mentioned of the project. And here, this is the kind of most embarrassing maybe moment of an architectural work where we all do these kinds of things. We just, we make compositions, we put things together, we try, and it's bad. So here there's a hesitance. It's just this kind of moment of, should I do this? Should I not do it, And then we have, obviously questioning the idea of scale as well, because what we have right now is a scaleless object. It doesn't mean anything. And then somehow it kind of gets a scale, kind of aperture, so it becomes kind of a quasi-building, or in this case, a model of a building. Through the objects around it, as I said, we can understand its scale and materiality, being tested, the texture mapping of it. And then somehow, when the objects around the model changes, its scale changes. So it's, for instance, a bigger model or smaller model, according to the way it's restaged. Okay, I'll just show the whole thing because it's going to end not in a very nice way. And the final demise. That just summarizes or kind of visual or kind of narrative of the project. So this is the last project that I want to conclude with. This is the Pavilion of Turkey project that was mentioned in 2021. I also, when I say I did this exhibition, I did a couple of years ago. Like, it was very close to 2021, but because of COVID, I think our cognition of time really changed. So I feel like it was 10 years ago. I acted both as the chief creator and designer for this exhibition. And the exhibition project takes my role to architecture and measure as a theoretical preamble, but it's not the presentation of the book. It proposes to think about architecture's planetary potential from within its inner workings. And it was presented through an installation, an online publication, and storytelling. So in the exhibition, we looked at the politics and nuances of the seemingly mundane aspects of architectural construction, and we juxtaposed those aspects with larger scale and even planetary dimensions, which are geographies of resource extraction, material supply chains, maintenance and care in Turkey and beyond. So the installation was in the Ars Annales section of the pavilion, and it was titled 4 Dioramas, which consisted of 4 rooms. Each diorama stages a generic site of architecture with banal details and a specific mise-en-scène of an imaginary story taking place in Turkey. Here, before showing the installation itself, I want to show you 2 contributions from our exhibition publication to make the kind of point about what we're trying to do in the exhibition project. On the left, you see a photograph of a quarry at the urban edge of Istanbul, the major city of Turkey, alongside with the big catalog on the right, which is widely used in architecture construction. So by putting these 2 images together, because when we go into BIM, there are these material catalogs and things, the image on the left is not in our mind, right? But so by putting these together, the relationship of these 2 worlds, the planetary, the geographic on the one hand, the architectural and the ordinary on the right, was really the kind of premise. So I think one of the reasons why I feel like it was a long time ago is that I wanted you to forget about it because it took so much time. The part of the reason is that it was originally planned for 2020, and we were about to, so the exhibition was going to happen May 2020, and then March 2020 the world changed. So we're in the last phase of finishing it, and then you have to reconceptualize, so the exhibition got postponed, obviously. So usually the Venice Biennale is a 1-year work, and so it became a kind of longer project. So because of that, we actually created these sneak peek images of the project. So these were the first images that people saw before the installation itself, and we presented our own project as an unfinished kind of model, like physical models that we're just working around. Some this is what the exhibition is going to look like, or another NEMESTUDIO table with some models. And we thought that that would be an interesting kind of interplay of presenting the kind of, almost like using the process of the 2 years to marinate the project or create an audience around it. So these are some images that we produced in the very beginning to kind of present these sneak images of, you know, these dioramas in construction are happening. So this is the real kind of finished state of the project. 4 dioramas are positioned next to one another, aligned with the lateral axis of the 6,000 square feet pavilion exhibition space. This is the pavilion of Turkey. And this is how they sit in the pavilion as 4 things. And we did them in such a way that 2 of them face one side and 2 of them face another, so that there is this circulation kind of, and then two sides of the space is actually used. This is a photograph of the finished state. Some drawings of the oblique drawings of the front and the back. And we got too excited sometimes, like trying to show the connections between how actually those transition circulation happens in between. And in a kind of very interesting way, the middle part where the 2, 4 dioramas, the 2 left and 2 right kiss, is actually fire exit route. So that actually was really interesting because in a way when you enter from a fire exit perspective, like the whole thing looks like giant and blocking it, but actually we were one of the more compliant projects from a fire exit perspective. So it was kind of shocking for the Italian architects of the kind of, they actually liked us very much, that we didn't create problems, and they were surprised that we didn't create problems with this object. So these are some plans showing the interiors of the dioramas. So this is what the kind of finished state of one of the dioramas look like. The visitors can walk inside the dioramas as if they are in the interior space actually of a giant architectural model. So as the dioramas collide, the architectural and the planetary, even the banal. By banal, I mean there are a lot of construction booths or things that are in construction that are in there, and spectacular because there's this giant drawings in the back, and the everyday, the mythical. So the ideas of, again, foreground and background are constantly flipped and negotiated. You just constantly think back and forth about these 2 things. So diorama, I talked about diorama a little bit, which is generally used as a device, as I said, to idealize nature or historical events in museums. In this case, it's purified from its ideal mystery because it's used now as a device to tell, like some other things I talked about, to talk about more difficult stories in Turkey, and by staging them with topics such as resource extraction, environmental justice, in the context of climate change. So, and if you think about back in dioramas in a Natural History Museum, a diorama is a stage. You cannot get into it. You're not in it. You're just watching it. But in this case, it's a stage, yes. It's almost like a 3D image, you can say, but actually you walk into it. So that experience puts your relationship to the image. When you're inside of it, you're in the image, you have to think about it, or you watch. You have to decide how much you want to engage with it, do you want to ignore it, and those kinds of things were interesting. So the dioramas depict 4 sites of architectural production. This is the first diorama, and it's a quarry. It's the diorama of quarry. So there's the frontal view of the diorama of quarry. Maybe you can again think about, maybe centuries from now, we're looking at the dioramas in a Natural History Museum, in this case in Turkey, and experiencing parts of a story that took place there. Through an archaeology of an imaginary future in Turkey, the story depicts in the dioramas, reflects actually on some current controversies in Turkey. So this is diorama of quarry, and this is a big drawing in the back. It depicts actually a marble quarry abandoned after centuries of resource extraction in a kind of ancient land in Turkey. So it's like a place in Turkey. We see a view towards an open-air museum and witness the extractive constructive activities of ancient times. So in the story, the ancient land is a site of conservation, repair, and cultural heritage, in which various ruins from previous centuries are collected. In addition, we see these mountain-like things. They're actually fake mountains. They are spoiled tips of abundant industrial waste, sculpted into shapes of various mountains. So these were actually various mountains from Turkey. They're shaped that way. Very famous kind of, pastoral imaginations. So these fake mountains are surrounded by replicas of large-scale infrastructures, such as dams, nuclear power plants, cooling towers, that are ancient, they are not used anymore, and they are ruins of that era. So the second one is a logistical warehouse, enabling, so there is a kind of a progression in these dioramas. There's a story being told, and then you get into it, you read about it, you see the drawing. So in this case, this warehouse enables massive transit of multi-species migration to a different place. So the old Turkey with extraction, with a lot of things is gone, and they're all moving out because it's maybe too extracted. There's nothing to extract left anymore. So this is the large site of that warehouse where all the materials circulate. It's a depot. The third one is a diorama of maintenance and care. It's a site of repair in the new land. So now we're in the new land. Both the built structures and the endangered more than human beings are continually giving maintenance and care. This is its view from the front. Referred to maybe in the story, they are called first inhabitants. These are actually animals and trees that are basically moving to a different land for a new beginning. They're not in maybe a new place in Turkey or a different place. For a new era of earthly survival, a celebration of shared living together. So they're very happy. There are no humans here. That's a good thing. And then, the aquarium is a giant aquarium that is shaped in a building, like a building. And this is a big drawing in the back. The fourth one is diorama formwork, and it's a site of construction. So these are, remember, all different sites. Now we're at the construction site. It is actually the reconstruction of the future inhabitants of the earth in relation to that kind of after that migration perhaps took place. This is where the front view of that diorama. And inside that diorama there is that drawing. So in this diorama, in the other ones there's always a big drawing, but in this case the drawing gets smaller and the space is bigger. So in that drawing we see actually a kind of century of maybe repair and care have passed. And we see this kind of maybe the first inhabitants, like these are generations after those. And this new land is now a site populated with all kinds of new species who are the new caregivers of this land. In the distance, we see various statues of more than human imaginaries. For instance, it's a very folkloric kind of, let's say, image from Anatolia. That's a kind of about an ancient story about a woman turning into a kind of snake, but there are all those kinds of, let's say, more than human imaginaries embedded in those folkloric stories. And we see those kinds of, appreciation of those things. And all these things, actually, every kind of little thing we see here give hints to new mythologies that we don't have. These are actually new imaginaries of the future. So in an exhibition that looks at the relationship between the inner workings of architecture and planetary imagination, it was important for us to rethink the inner workings and techniques of the architecture exhibition itself. Rather than conceptualizing the architecture exhibition as a space that can only be activated through the visualization of research, which is a usual thing that we do in architecture, or publication content, the book is actually exhibited, or with the program it becomes a kind of exhibition, meaning it's like devoid of anything, and then you bring event and then it becomes a space. Instead of doing all these things, we wanted to design an exhibition space that works actually like a diorama when viewed from the outside, and a large-scale architecture model when it's viewed from the inside. This is I like this drawing, but there's a somewhat sad story behind it, because when we started the project, the idea was obviously, COVID had not happened yet. So our idea was that actually the story that I talked about was going to be enacted. There was going to be 4 acts throughout the Biennale of 6 months, and there will be 4 of them, and then we will actually watch these stories that are kind of, maybe staged in these dioramas. So we will act as a stage 1, and we will record them. And we made a drawing of it. We got so excited about this. But obviously, I shouldn't say sad, because maybe this was never going to happen anyways. Now we have to go as an excuse. So because of COVID, it was not possible to coordinate, everybody wearing masks and this and that. This was just not possible. So, but it just remained as a drawing, as an idea that we didn't do. So even for built things, sometimes there will be residues of things that didn't get to reality. So this is how the kind of, there were these boards that explained, there's always very nice requirement in Biennale that it's not very visible here, but every text, as you see in Diagrama Forma, Diagrama della Casa Forma, every text, anything that you put as a text needs to have an Italian translation. Maybe that's extra work for everyone, but I kind of, when we did the research about who the audience of this exhibition is, we actually realized that most, like if you look at percentages, I forgot now, but maybe more than 60% is actually students, Italian students, high school students, university students that actually come and see this, and architects are a very small portion of it. So we were interested in, so we thought the storytelling aspect of it would actually play that role. So I'm sure there are many typos in Italian, I don't know, but we really took that seriously to put the kind of Italian context there. So in addition to the installation, the exhibition also extended onto a website. From the very beginning, like again before COVID, we were not interested in creating another exhibition catalog where people just fine, put it in the bag and never read again. And also we were questioning the idea of accessibility, meaning how many people can really go to this Biennale, how many percentage of the architecture students can go to Italy and really see these things. So we were interested in creating the publication as a website, so that Chico graduate book that is accessible outside. But then after COVID, it was just not when we did this, people all thought that this was because of COVID, but actually this was something that we actually really thought about in the kind of competition process of this, selection and everything. So instead of producing a physical catalog, the exhibition interpreted the publication as a layered e-publication, and because we had 2 years, that's why maybe it was exhausting, doesn't work, because we really published kind of content 2 years, different things, and it's, it was changing each time to the end of the Biennale. So each published piece of the project existed on the website as a digital page, but also there were PDFs that were designed by the graphic designers, so you could actually download the article and then create your own archive or curate the catalog that you want from those printed PDFs. So there were also sections of the publication. This is actually a section that I really liked, which is called the paperwork section. In this section of the publication, we presented exhibition's main research content on the bureaucracy of architecture documents that enact, facilitate, and normalize protocols of extraction, maintenance, logistics, construction, and actual labor. So here, for instance, in this piece, we, the curatorial team, is analyzing an architecture contract sample or template from Turkish Chamber of Architects, and then really questioning some of the terminology of how expectations of labor in relation to architectural offices. So there was another section in the publication which restaged that narrative or that story that I talked about. This really started before, again, the exhibition was physicalized, so people actually read, these are almost like a pre-story of the story. So it's almost like a kind of episode series that you start to watch and you're just curious what's going to happen. So these were just like kind of vignettes of things that are related to the story that we tell in the dioramas. And then we also had a section where we met with thinkers, architects, construction workers. Actually, that was my favorite interview. We made an interview with Turkish construction workers about construction in Turkey, and actually, so there were these interviews with academics, with lawyers, with construction workers, geographers, and from different disciplines to kind of really talk around some of the topics that in this case is a conversation on bureaucracy. And also the dioramas in the pavilion showcase some of this publication content, printed versions, become part of the mise-en-scène of the stories that are depicted. So, like if the quarry, diorama of quarry, there are things that are related to extraction. But we were not really interested in, people coming in and, reading these things in the dioramas. It was more of the QR codes that we strategically place so that they can just go to the website if they want to. But it's not a kind of pedagogical project where you're expecting people to read all this in the space. It's almost like if you're interested, there's another space to engage. If not, that's perfectly fine. So in addition to the dioramas, there was a table in the front side of the pavilion, which we call table of contents, which presents a more selective publication content, depicting a table of in-progress curatorial work. Through provided QR codes on the table, the users could access the published exhibition content on the website. So it's both a curatorial depiction of the curatorial table and another entry point to the exhibition. These are some other photographs. So through its focus on the entangled relationship between the quotidian and the planetary, Architecture and Measure exhibition suggests another route for architecture's relation to the world, in which it is more of an agent than just a respondent. It aspires to provide another form of inner focus, and thus engagement for architecture. So to conclude, I believe this is the last, so I'm gonna basically talk a little bit when this is running, and I'll maybe stop and then we can go questions and we can play. You don't have to watch the whole thing. And also there are some scenes where I'm speaking, so it's very awkward to see, to show yourself speaking while you're speaking. So to conclude, this was a video, by the way, we did, because this was 2021, May 2021, so the exhibition opened and there was this interest from the commissioner of the Turkish Pavilion that for it to be able to access to wider audiences, it would be better to have a kind of curatorial tour of the project as a video so that people could watch, especially from Turkey, to kind of at least feel, have an engagement to it. So this was particularly done for that, and it kind of explains the project and goes through it. So to conclude, I believe there are two reasons, maybe more, but for now two, why it's important to think about architecture in the ways that I presented today. First is to think about the powerful relationship between imagination and realism and their relation to one another. Instead of understanding realism as descriptions or facts, or understanding imagination as avoidance of confrontation with the real, I am, and our work is interested in slightly unfamiliar realisms, where you can actually have the capacity or cultivate a capacity to be able to think them kind of together or switch back and forth between them. Second is their provocation, perhaps, for new forms of attention for how we see and how we learn to see. Searching for other imaginations and representations is one of the necessary steps, I believe, is toward that. So that's the end of my presentation. And I'll just maybe show a little bit of the video, and then I pause, and we just can talk about it. You can sound like
we look at the common
to the part where I don't want to listen to me talking, right? Now you're going to watch this and always ask a question. That's the problem.
Your head memorized.
I know. Are there any questions? Or you want to watch this? So you're like visiting the exhibition right now. before us, there were some, you know, like some materials, like mostly wood, that we actually used. So some of those, which was nice. Actually, we never just made it that kind of thing in the project. We just did it. We didn't want to kind of really advertise, but this was something that we reused. And those things, there are certain parts of it. Actually, it's gone. We're not going to exhibit it again, if that's what you're asking. And some of what we did is like the pieces of those things. We gave some of those kind of, you know, plinths to museums, and you know. So some of the stuff is like reused, but there was actually interest to re-exhibit it, but the thing that was this was my first time working in the Venice Architecture Biennale. There's so much shipping, and the amount of energy and money that's spent on shipping, it's just ridiculous, because you go to Venice and think, why do you pick this place for shipping stuff? Because it's impossible to, like the port, from the port, you have to, everything needs to come by ship, like by just, you know, there's no transportation by car or anything. So this creates this economy around that area, and we purposefully did not want to do an exhibition. We didn't ship anything. Everything was just like local, kind of, you know, builders and stuff like that. So that was one thing. We want to also kind of, there was an interest, some places were interested to re-exhibit this, to dismantle, and just like when you look at the numbers to kind of move these things, we just thought it actually, maybe because I spent 2 years like working on this, I was not just very sympathetic on to kind of reassemble it again and again and again. So it now lives in the memories of those who visited, and also some of the, and another interesting fact is that we were told after the exhibition ended, which is November 2021, that actually this year was the most exhibited of all architecture beyond, which is really strange, like in terms of the amount of people who visited this exhibition. Which I think what happened is that after the COVID restrictions got a little more loose, and with masks we could go everywhere, people just really, like anyone who doesn't even have an interest in architecture wanted to really go to this Biennale. So I think that's interesting. That's an interesting fact. The creator, the general creator of the exhibition was very happy about that. So.
Why did you choose the color yellow?
I'm so glad you asked, because in every meeting there's one.
It's pretty.
So there was actually a couple of reasons, but the first, actually, it was like a mixture of a couple of things. One, when we were trying different color schemes,